Ndị be anyị kenekwanụ m unu. Anyị sị ka ụbọchị nke taa mara na anyị na mma. Anyị sị ka nke onye chiri ya zelụkwa. Dịka o si dị ya bụkwa Easter News 24 ka anyị si were wetara ya bụ ozi unu je gị n'ugbu a n'iru akwụkwọ n'ụbọchị uruchi nke taa gbasata maka ya bụ ife na-eme n'obodo nọ n'ime ya anụ nwere onwe a na-azụ n'ala Igbo. Alright, dịka o si dị ka agbapụnụ ya ọsọ ife aba according to one of the Biafran activists, Finland-based activists ya bịa wetara anyị ozi a n'iru akwụkwọ. Quote, stay on the Mazi Simon Ekpa trial. As Nigerian government in the panic after Israel, Russia sent a delegate in Finland to monitor the ongoing court case between Mazi Simon Ekpa and Nigerian government. Hear the news in details. Alright, can I get if you want to know because drop what I feature no think again. All right, over to you.
The evidence shown was weak and didn't clearly prove my client caused any violence. The court needs to see the full picture of what happened online and not just parts that the other side wants to show. My client's posts were misunderstood. We are sure that a fair look at all facts will show my client is innocent. This statement from Simon's lawyer did not sit well with the prosecuting lawyer, and that is why he stood up by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense is attempting to distract you from the very real consequences of the defendant's actions. While they may argue about the context of the post, the fact remains violence occurred. People were harmed. The defendant's words, broadcast to a wide audience, fueled that violence. We will present evidence linking those words to specific acts of unrest, demonstrating the tangible harm caused by the defendant's online activity. The defense's attempt to minimize the impact of these words is an insult to the victims and disservice to justice. We ask you to consider the very real harm caused by the defendant's actions." And this, like I said, this is a statement coming from the prosecuting lawyer addressed to the judge. This whole statement coming from the prosecuting lawyer did not sit well with Simon's lawyer, and that is why he stood up and said, "The prosecution is trying to make my client look guilty by saying his social media post caused the violence, but that's not the whole story. They are only showing you some posts, not all of them, and they are taking things out of context. My client was talking about important issues, but that's not the same as telling people to be violent. The prosecution is trying to make it seem like my client's words directly caused the violence, but they haven't shown any real proof of that. They are guessing, not showing facts. We are going to show you that the violence had many causes, not just my client's post. We'll also show that other people were saying similar things, but only my client is being blamed. That is not fair." On that note, I'm going to call on my second witness to take the stand and testify that my client's post was not inciting in any way, shape, or form. At this point, Simon's lawyer called upon his second witness. Yes, this person is a second witness because he previously in a court session, he called a very first witness that was codenamed Peace. But today he presented a second witness, and this witness is codenamed Casey. At this point, Simon's lawyer called upon Casey to take the stance because he wants to cross-examine Casey. He wants to ask him some questions that will help prove that Simon is not guilty but innocent. Yes. So let's take a look at the cross-examination between Simon's lawyer and Casey, a witness who happens to be a close friend of Simon. So Casey took to the stand and Simon's lawyer continued or asked him a couple of questions. He was like, "Good morning, Casey. Thank you for being here today. You've known Simon for quite some time, haven't you?" Casey replied by saying, "Good morning. Yes, I've known Simon for over 5 years. We've worked together on several community projects." The defense lawyer, which is Simon, continued by saying, "That's great to hear. Can you describe Simon's character? What kind of person is he?" Casey replied by saying, "Absolutely. Simon is one of the most compassionate and dedicated individuals I know. He's always advocating for social justice and equality. He genuinely cares about people and believes in peaceful solutions in problems." Simon's lawyer asked, "Have you ever seen this man, my client, engage in any violent behavior or express violent thoughts?" Casey replied by saying, "Never. Simon is all about peaceful activism. He believes in dialogue and understanding, not violence. I've seen him handle tense situations with calmness and reason. The defense lawyer, which is Simon's lawyer, continued by saying, now, let's talk about Simon's social media post, which the prosecuting lawyer believes or claims incites violence. Have you reviewed this post? Casey replied or answered by saying, yes, I have. I looked at them closely and I can tell you that they do not incite violence at all. Simon's lawyer continued by saying, what do you believe Simon was trying to convey through this post? Casey replied by saying, Simon was expressing his frustration with social injustice and calling for change. His posts were about raising awareness and encouraging people to come together peacefully. He was advocating for constructive dialogue, not violence. Simon's lawyer responded by saying, the prosecution has highlighted specific phrases from Simon's post as evidence of incitement. Can you address those concerns? Casey replied by saying, certainly. The prosecution is taking those phrases out of context. For example, when Simon used strong language, it was to emphasize the urgency of the issues at hand, not to incite violence. If you read the entire post, it's clear he was advocating for peaceful protest and community engagement. The lawyer continued by saying, can you give me an example of specific post that prosecution has misinterpreted? Casey said, yes. There's one post where Simon talks about the need for people to stand up against injustice. The prosecution claims he was inciting violence, but in reality, he was encouraging people to participate in peaceful demonstrations. He explicitly stated that violence is not the answer. Simon's lawyer replied by saying, the prosecution has also suggested that Simon's social media activity paints him as a terrorist. How do you respond to that? Casey said, that's completely unfounded. Simon is not a terrorist. He's a community activist. He has dedicated his life to helping others and promoting positive change. Labeling him a terrorist is not only inaccurate, but also deeply disrespectful to his character and his work. Simon's lawyer responded by saying, can you provide specific examples of Simon's community involvement that demonstrate his commitment to peace? Casey said, absolutely. Simon has organized numerous peaceful protests led by community cleanup initiatives and volunteered at local shelters. He's also been involved in efforts to uplift the community through non-violent means. For instance, last year, he organized a peaceful march to raise awareness about local environmental issues, and it has a huge success here in Finland. The defense lawyer said, in your opinion, is Simon a threat to public safety? Casey replied by saying, not at all. Simon is a force for good in our community. He promotes understanding and cooperation among people. He's everything terrorist is not. Simon's lawyer continued by asking, the prosecution might argue that Simon's passionate language could be interpreted as inflammatory. How would you counter that? Casey responded by saying, passionate language is not the same as incitement. Simon's passion comes from a place of deep concern for social justice. He uses his voice to advocate for positive change, and he channels his passion into organizing peaceful actions. His intent is always to inspire, not to incite. The defense lawyer said, thank you, Casey. Your insights are invaluable. One last question. Do you believe that Simon's actions and words align with principles of peaceful activism? Casey answered, absolutely. Simon embodies the principle of peaceful activism. He believes in power of dialogue and community engagement. His actions consistently demonstrate the commitment to non-violence and social justice. The lawyer continued by saying, thank you, Casey. Your testimony has been incredibly helpful in clarifying Simon's character and intentions. That concludes my questionings. At this point, the prosecuting lawyer wasn't too happy with the responses coming from Simon's lawyer and this testifier known as Casey. The prosecuting lawyer stood up and said, Your Honor, I would like to bring to the court's attention a matter of significant concern regarding the witness Casey and the defendant's lawyer. It has come to my attention that there is a strong possibility that Casey and the defense counsel have engaged in rehearsing their questions and answers prior to this testimony. This practice raises serious ethical questions about the integrity of the witness testimony. While it's common for lawyers to prepare their witnesses, there's a fine line between proper preparation and coaching. The latter can lead to distortion of the truth and undermine the very foundation of our judicial system. My Lord, Permit me to cross-examine Casey. And the judge gives his permission. Yes. So now at this point in time, the prosecuting lawyer wants to cross-examine Casey because he believes that Casey and Simon's lawyer rehearsed their questions and answer. So the prosecuting lawyer wants to talk to Casey directly and see if he can somehow, some way remove or deduce data that definitely will be used against Simon. So the prosecuting lawyer asks Casey, "Good morning, Casey. Thanks for being here today. I would like to ask you some questions to clarify your testimony regarding Simon." Casey replied by saying, "Good morning, I'm here to help." The prosecuting lawyer said, "You mentioned that you've known Simon for over 5 years. Can you tell us how often you interact with him?" Casey said, "We interact regularly, especially during community projects and events. We often collaborate on initiatives aimed at improving our neighborhood." The prosecuting lawyer said, "Well, would you say you have a close relationship with Simon?" Casey said, "Yes, I consider him a good friend. We share similar values, goals when it comes to community service." The prosecuting lawyer replied, "Given your close relationship, is it possible that your views on Simon are biased?" Casey replied, "I understand how that might be perceived, but I believe my views are based on his actions and character, not just our friendship. I've seen him in various situations, and he consistently demonstrates integrity and compassion." The prosecuting lawyer said, "You stated that Simon's social media posts were about raising awareness and advocating for peaceful change. Can you explain how you interpret the language he used in those posts?" Casey replied by saying, "Certainly, Simon uses strong language to express urgency about social issues, but his intent is always peaceful. He aims to inspire action, not violence. For example, when he talks about standing up against injustice, he's calling for unity and peaceful protest." The prosecuting lawyer said, "However, some of those posts contain phrases that could be interpreted as inflammatory. For instance, when Simon said, 'We must rise up against injustice,' how do you reconcile that with the idea of peaceful protest?" Casey said, "I see your point, but context is crucial. Simon's call to rise up is not about violence. It's about mobilizing people to engage in peaceful demonstrations. He often emphasizes the importance of non-violent methods in his post." The prosecuting lawyer said, "Context is important indeed, but do you think that the average person reading this post might interpret them differently, perhaps as incitement?" Casey said, "It's possible, but I believe that if they read the full context and if they watch his full videos, they will understand his true intent. Simon often follows up with messages about the importance of peaceful dialogue and constructive action." The prosecuting lawyer replied by saying, "You mentioned that Simon has organized peaceful protests. Can you provide specific examples of these events and their outcomes?" Casey said, "Yes, he organized a march last year focused on environmental issues, which was peaceful and well received by the community. We had local leaders speak about the importance of sustainability, and the event fostered a sense of community and collaboration." The prosecuting lawyer replied by saying, "Were there any incidents of violence or unrest at this event?" Casey said, "No, there were no incidents. Simon emphasizes non-violence in all his activities. He believes that change can be achieved through understanding and cooperation and not through conflict." The prosecuting lawyer continued or responded with, "You also stated that Simon is not a terrorist. Can you explain what you believe constitutes a terrorist act?" Casey said, "A terrorist act involves using violence, intimidation to achieve political aims. Simon does not engage in any such behavior. His actions are rooted in peaceful activism and community building." The prosecuting lawyer said, "So, if Simon's posts were interpreted as inciting violence, would you still stand by your assertion that he's not a terrorist?" Casey said, "Yes, because his intent was never to incite violence. He advocates for peaceful solutions and encourages others to do the same. His post about raising awareness and fostering dialogue, not by promoting violence." The prosecuting lawyer said, "Thank you, Casey. One last question. Do you think your close relationship with Simon might affect your objectivity in assessing his actions and words?" Casey said, "I believe I can be objective. I focus on his actions and the positive impact he has on the community. I have seen firsthand how he inspires others to engage in constructive dialogue and peaceful activism. The prosecuting lawyer said, "Thank you for your responses, Casey. That concludes my questioning." Casey answered, "Thank you for your opportunity to clarify my views." Wow, Casey as a witness has answered or replied to all of the questions coming from the prosecuting lawyer excellently without mixing or mincing words. Casey happens to be a well-informed individual. He knew what he was supposed to say and things he shouldn't say. Well, during the course of the conversation, Simon's lawyer replied, "My lord, as you can see, my witness Casey has answered all the questions from the prosecuting lawyer with complete honesty and transparency. He also provided clear and consistent responses, demonstrating a genuine understanding of the situation and Simon's character. His testimony has been both informative and compelling, shedding light on the true nature of Simon's actions and intentions. The witness has not shied away from any question, and his answers have been forthright and unwavering. Therefore, my lord, I believe that Casey's testimony has been invaluable in providing a balanced perspective on the matters at hand. With that, and with the court's permission, I would like to call my next witness to the stand. My next witness is a member of a top human rights group in Europe. Permit me to call upon my next witness." And the judge replied by saying, "The stage is all yours. Feel free to call your next witness in." So at this point, Simon wants to bring in his third testifier or witness to the stand. Yes, and this witness is a lawyer and a human rights activist in Europe. So let's go back to the courtroom and see the conversation had between Simon's lawyer and this new witness. So this new witness, based out of the conversation had in the courtroom, this witness was codenamed Jet, G-E-T, Jet. So let's see the conversation had between Simon's lawyer and this new witness known as Jet. So Simon's lawyer asked, "Jet, thank you for joining us today. As a human rights activist and lawyer, you have extensive knowledge of freedom of speech. Can you clarify for the court the extent of this right?" Jet replied by saying, "Certainly, freedom of speech, as enshrined in many international human rights instruments, is a fundamental right. It protects the expression of ideas, belief, and opinions, even those considered controversial or unpopular. This right is not absolute, but it has a broad protection." Simon's lawyer continued by saying, "The prosecution argues that Simon's social media post incited violence. How does this accusation relate to the concept of freedom of speech?" Jet replied by saying, "The line between protected speech and incitement to violence is a complex one. While freedom of speech allows for criticism of government, expression of unpopular views, and even strong rhetoric, it does not protect speech that directly incites imminent violence. The key is intent and imminence. More criticism, even harsh criticism, is not incitement." The lawyer continued by saying, "Can you elaborate on the intent and imminence criteria? What evidence would be needed to prove incitement to violence?" Jet responded by saying, "To prove incitement, the prosecution would need to demonstrate that Simon intended to cause imminent lawless action and that his words were likely to produce such action. It's not enough to show that someone was offended or that his words are inflammatory. There must be a direct causal link between the speech and the likelihood of immediate violence." Simon's lawyer continued by saying, "The prosecution has highlighted certain phrases from Simon's post. How would you assess these phrases in context of incitement?" Jet, who happens to be a human rights activist and a lawyer, responded by saying, "We need to examine the phrases within the context of the entire post. Simon's overall online activity and the specific circumstances surrounding their publication. Were they isolated statements or part of a broader campaign for peaceful change? What was the tone and intent behind these words? Were there calls for specific violent acts, or were there general expressions of frustration?" The lawyer responded by saying, "Let's consider a specific example. The prosecution points to a post where Simon used the phrase, 'We must take action.' How would you interpret this in light of freedom of speech? Taking action is a vague term. In itself, it doesn't constitute incitement. It could refer to peaceful protest, civil disobedience, or even simply writing letters to elected officials. The prosecution needs to show that his phrase, within its context, unequivocally called for immediate and unlawful violence. Simon's lawyer continued by saying, the prosecution also argues that Simon's use of strong language and emotionally charged rhetoric demonstrates intent to incite violence. How would you respond to that? Jet, the testifier, said, strong language and emotional rhetoric are often used in political discourse and social activism. Such language in itself is not illegal. The crucial question is whether the language directly and explicitly incites imminent violence. The prosecution needs to provide a clear intent to incite violence, not merely show that someone used strong words. Simon's lawyer continued by saying, the prosecution seems to be conflating passionate advocacy with incitement. Can you explain the difference? Jet said, absolutely. Passionate advocacy is a hallmark of effective activism. It involves using strong language to express concerns and mobilize support for a cause. Incitement, on the other hand, is the deliberate and purposeful act of provoking immediate violence. They are distinct concepts. One is protected speech, the other, it's not. Simon's lawyer continued by saying, let's discuss the concept of imminence. How imminent does the threat of violence need to be to constitute incitement? Jet replied, the threat must be immediate and likely to occur. General calls for violence at some unspecified time in the future are unlikely to meet the threshold for incitement. The prosecution needs to show a clear and present danger of violence directly resulting from Simon's words. Simon's lawyer continued by saying, in your professional opinion, does Simon's social media activity meet the legal threshold for incitement to violence? Jet, the testifier, said, based on my understanding of the law and the evidence presented so far, I do not believe it does. The prosecution has not demonstrated the necessary intent and eminence to prove incitement. Simon's speech, while perhaps strong or controversial, falls within the bounds of protected expression. The defense lawyer said, thank you, Jet. Your testimony has been extremely helpful in clarifying the legal standards related to freedom of speech and incitement. That concludes my questioning. At this point, the prosecuting lawyer asked the judge to grant him permission to cross-examine Jet. Jet, who, like I said, is a lawyer and a human rights activist from a top group in Europe. So the prosecuting lawyer got the permission from the judge and he walked up to the stand to cross-examine Jet. The lawyer started this conversation by saying, good morning, Jet. Thank you for your testimony today. You've stated that Simon's social media posts fall under the protection of freedom of speech. Can you clarify what you mean by that? Jet replied by saying, good morning. Yes, I believe that Simon's post express his opinions and frustrations regarding social media issues, which are protected under the right of freedom of speech. The prosecuting lawyer said, however, freedom of speech is not absolute, is it? There are limitations, especially when it comes to incitement to violence. Would you agree? Jet answered by saying, absolutely, there are limitations. Speech that directly incites imminent violence is not protected. However, the key is determining whether Simon's post meets that threshold. The prosecuting lawyer said, you mentioned the importance of context. Let's discuss a specific post where Simon stated, we must take action. How do you interpret that in the context of potential incitement? Jet answered by saying, in my view, taking action is a vague phrase that could refer to various forms of activism, including peaceful protests. It does not inherently call for violence. The prosecuting lawyer said, but is it possible that some individuals could interpret that as a call to violent action, especially given the current social climate? Jet answered, while interpretations can vary, the law requires a clear intent to incite violence. Someone's posts do not explicitly call for violence and the context matters significantly. The prosecuting lawyer said, you also mentioned that strong language is common in activism. Can you explain how that might be misinterpreted as incitement? At this point, Simon got really angry and upset with the way and manner the prosecuting lawyer has been handling his questions. At this point in time, Simon got really angry and it was very visible in the court of law. At this point in time, this man, Simon, tore a document, a paper that he was holding because while the conversations between the prosecuting lawyer and Jet were on, Simon was taking notes. And when he got angry at this point in time, he tore that paper. Yes, so let's go back to the conversation. At this point, Jet replied the question he received from the prosecuting lawyer that, see, strong language can be a powerful tool for mobilizing support and expressing urgency. However, it does not equate to incitement. The intent behind the words is crucial. So the prosecuting lawyer said, let's consider the emotional impact of Simon's post. Do you believe that emotionally charged rhetoric can lead to real-world consequences, including violence? Jet answered, emotionally charged rhetoric can certainly inspire action, but it does not automatically lead to violence. The prosecution must have a direct link between Simon's words and any violent actions. The prosecuting lawyer continued by saying, you've stated that Simon's post do not meet the legal threshold for incitement. What specific evidence would you require to change your opinion? Jet answered, I will need to see clear evidence that Simon intended to incite imminent violence and that his words were likely to produce such action. Mere speculation or emotional reactions are insufficient. The prosecuting lawyer responded by saying, in your professional opinion, does the current social unrest surrounding Simon's post affect the interpretation of his words? Jet responded by saying, social unrest can influence how speech is perceived, but it does not change the legal standards for incitement. Each case must be evaluated based on the specific content and intent of the speech. And the prosecuting lawyer said, finally, Jet, if Simon's post were to be interpreted as incitement, would you still defend his right to free speech? Jet responded, I would defend his right to free speech, but I would also acknowledge that if his words were found to incite imminent violence, they would not be protected. The distinction is critical. And the prosecuting lawyer said, thank you, Jet, your insights have been valuable, but I believe the prosecution has demonstrated that Simon's post could indeed be interpreted as inciting violence. That concludes my questioning. Yes, and the prosecuting lawyer was done with the cross-examination of the testifier or the witness known as Jet. At this point, the judge said he has had enough, that he would want this whole conversation and this whole court hearings to continue on a later date, probably on Monday. Yes, so this is the full conversations had in the courtroom today, and this happened to be a very, very tense conversation. Anyway, if you find this video interesting, please do well to subscribe and turn on post notifications. And just in case you missed our video yesterday that showcased every single detail that played out in the courtroom yesterday, please do well to click on this video to watch and understand. Click on this particular video and I'll see you on the other side. Thanks for watching.
Ndị ba ngwe kenekwe ni muno. Ọzọ dị ka ibia bụ ihe abụọ Eastern News 24 ka isi wene wetara ya bụ ozi unu nụrụ ugbu a n'iru akwụkwọ. Ekefu nwere ikwu gbasata maka ya bụ ife ndị a niile wetara unu. Drọpụrụ anyị feature n'ụdị nke gị na Eastern News 24 ebe isi wene wetara ya bụ ozi dị oke mkpa. Ngwa nke mesịa na ụmụnne m.